here today to talk about the type of dangers that occur in data science work in terms of the impact it has externally, not kind of like construction operation danger, not danger to data scientists, but the type of danger that can impact people when our models are deployed. And by deployed, I don't only mean in production, in a tech cycle production, but deployed in society at large. And when I use the term data scientist, I mean, we've all got 1,000 different definitions of a data scientist. I'm really interested in talking about people such as many of us who are involved in the production of models that are deployed at scale, essentially. So you could also call this talk product manager or the most. That may even be more apt, essentially. I'm just having a dig at product managers there. So what we need to talk about today, essentially, is where we are, the types of models we build, how we got here, and paths forward. The reason I put Charlie Chaplin from Modern Times here is I think it's nice to think, well, it's not nice, but it is an apt analogy to think ourselves as like building things that we're kind of stuck inside of simultaneously. So whenever I see or hear about models out there that are doing harm, I think of Charlie Chaplin being sucked up into the clockwork and trying to fix it as he builds it. I also think, silent cinema from early to mid 20th century, there's actually a lot of lessons to do with industrialization of society that are applicable now. Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Jacques Tati are three really good examples, maybe Harold Lloyd as well. But I'm not here to talk about the silent cinema of the earlier 20th century. I'm here to talk about where we are initially, okay? So Michael Jordan, who's at Berkeley, who happens to be literally the Michael Jordan of machine learning, but also in a lot of ways, figuratively, for me anyway, the greatest of all time. Published in the inaugural Harvard Data Science Review in June this year, an article called AI, The Revolution Hasn't Happened Yet. And what he tells us there is that a lot of us essentially are building societal scale and planetary scale inference and decision-making systems that impact and involve machines, humans, and the environment. And he makes very clear that what we're missing is a principled system of engineering and design in building these systems. And he makes the point that just as humans built buildings and bridges before civil engineering, structural engineering existed as disciplines, we're essentially doing that with at scale, planetary and societal scale algorithms. And here we go. Here he says, what we're missing is an engineering discipline with principles of analysis and design. And I think we do have a number of things to learn from structural and civil engineering. But before we go there, I kind of want to, before I'm talking about what we are doing, I want to kind of consider a bit tongue-in-cheek and provocatively what we do have. And essentially, we have what David Donahoe calls recycled intelligence. So this is one of the great classification challenges of trying to figure out chihuahua heads versus muffins, okay? There are even a few there that I'm not sure which is which. There's even one which I think is a chihuahua dressed as a muffin, but I'll let you pick out which one that is. But essentially, to do this type of challenge, as we know, you need thousands of hand-labeled examples. And that's exactly David Donahoe's point, which when we call it artificial intelligence, essentially, a lot of the time, we're getting humans to do a task, and we're recycling that intelligence by getting computers to mimic it, usually in a quite fragile, brittle way. Okay? I wonder what adversarial attacks on these chihuahuas would look like. So let's just talk a bit about how structural failure can occur in structural engineering, in civil engineering, because there are some analogs in productized data science products. So one way is that the structure is not strong enough to support the load. A second way is fatigue or corrosion. A third is manufacturing error or defective materials. And a fourth is lack of consideration of unexpected problems, okay, such as environmental factors or bad actors, which we think a lot about when deploying algorithms at scale. What type of analogs? And this isn't intended to be exhaustive at all, but what type of analogs can we see in data science workflows? I'm actually missing, okay. Yep. So structural failure in data science, The first analog we can think of is poor design. We'll see many examples where we expect data science work to generalize and it just doesn't, okay? Another aspect of poor design is not all users are considered. So if you're building bridges, you really want to think about who's going to be walking across those bridges. And if you're building buildings, you want to be thinking about who's going to be inside those buildings, right? Fatigue or corrosion. One analog is lack of maintenance. That's how fatigue and corrosion manifest themselves. An example here is model, concept drift, data drift in deployed algorithms world. The third is failure due to bad parts, training data, bad assumptions, relying too much on one objective function, and also thinking about failure due to data flow between these parts as well. And the fourth, environmental factors, lack of consideration of unexpected problems. One example there, bad actors such as Cambridge Analytica. So, I just wanted to say a bit about building before structural engineering existed. This is the oldest known building, well, the oldest surviving building I could find on the internet anyway, which maybe we just, because we are the information civilization now, that is the oldest known building. It's called the Cairn of Banane in France, which was built around 5000 BC, okay? Now, what we see on the right here is buckling, which people knew existed, but it wasn't until 1757 that Euler was the first person to mathematically describe buckling and discovered the formula for his critical load, which tells us how much mass you can put on a beam of a particular material while it can still handle supporting that weight. So essentially, for thousands of years before we even knew really how buckling worked, we were building buildings. And I argue that's where we are, essentially, in the systems we're building. There may not be a precise analog of buckling, but I think it's instructive to recognize that a lot of these things were built beforehand. It was only maybe 50 years after he discovered buckling, or the formula for his critical load, that the Institution of Civil Engineers was first founded, which I think is also quite telling. Now, Michael Jordan. So yeah, what I'm going to do now is go through a series of cases of where we're engineering these types of inference and decision-making systems at scale. I'm going to talk about medicine to start. So Michael Jordan tells an example in this article about when his wife was pregnant around a decade and a half ago, when the ultrasound showed white spots around the heart. The specialist, the geneticist in the room, said that these are possible markers for Down syndrome, and the risk of Down syndrome has gone up to 1 in 20 due to these white markers. The specialist suggested or said amniocentesis was an option to tell more, but that's fatal in 1 out of 300 cases. Michael Jordan, being the Michael Jordan of machine learning and statistics, then went and did some research into all the work that had been done to tell that these white spots were markers for Down syndrome. And what he found is that the paper that was being referenced and the body of research was done on trials that had lower resolution. The ultrasound had lower resolution. And what he discovered was that the white spots were most likely white noise, literal white noise, and giving false positives due to the increased resolution of the modern ultrasound. When he told the specialists that, they said, oh, that makes sense. Because when we got these new machines, we did see an uptick in Down syndrome markers. What was scarier was that Jordan then went and did a back of the envelope calculation to discover that thousands of people on the day that he went would have received this diagnosis, and a handful would have had fetal fatalities. So now let's talk about engineering finance at a planetary scale. This is something that we saw on November 7th. So this is a few days ago, right? Where David Hansen, creator of Ruby on Rails and co-founder and CTO at DataCamp, discovered that the Apple Card was offering him 20x the credit limits than it was his wife, although all their finances are together. And this kicked up quite a storm on social media, and we even saw Steve Wozniak come into the conversation saying that he can borrow 10 times as much as his wife on their Apple Cards, and Wozniak states that algorithms have obvious flaws, and a huge number of people would say, we love our technology, but we are no longer in control. I also include a post by Linda Lacewell, superintendent of New York State Department of Financial Services, who's responded to this, and she's also put a call out on Twitter for people who encounter these types of algorithms. So it's great to see that even in a few days, we have something opening up like this, and then conversations start to occur around it. How else are we seeing finance being engineered at scale? I'll remind you of the mid-20th century practice of redlining, in which surveyors from the Homeowners Loan Corporation would colour certain neighbourhoods red to deem them hazardous for bank loans. Neighbourhoods were redlined due to the presence of African Americans, immigrants, or Jewish people. It's been illegal for 50 years now, and yet it still occurs in a variety of ways, just not as explicitly. In the past couple of years, we've seen, a lot of research and articles published about modern-day redlining, how banks block people of color from home ownership. A recent study showed that in Baltimore, race impacts mortgage lending more than income does. And studies have found that proprietary credit score algorithms have a discriminatory impact on borrowers of color as well. So this is still happening. You may also remember a huge fiasco around predatory payday loan ads. So these were ads that were served to people who made Google queries such as, we need money to pay, I need money to pay rent. And they would have, I think, annual interest rates of up to 2,000%, regularly between 300 and 900, but up to 2,000%. And in 2016, Google banned all payday loan ads on their platform. And this seems like a really good thing, right? And I think it is in a lot of respects. I do want to ask the question, do we want these types of societal scale finance engineering decisions to be made by big tech companies, such as Google? So I think that's something we need to discuss. I'll also mention that Sophia Noble has discussed data redlining in the form of something called technological redlining. And this book in particular, it's essentially about the power of algorithms and the way those digital decisions reinforce oppressive social relationships and enact new modes of racial profiling. And these are what Sophia Noble calls technological redlining. So we can see in 2013, what Google autocompletes for why are black women so as compared to why are white women so. And I'll mention in passing also the bias inherent in a lot of facial recognition. One thing is it's far worse at predicting people of color. And something I discovered recently is that I wondered why this is the case, and essentially it's baked into the design principles of our systems, and it's a historical and cultural artifact that essentially, and I'm going to quote from the right-hand article here from Lens, from the Times, that photography is not just a system of calibrating light, but a technology of subjective decisions, okay? So previously, when you sent your film to get developed, lab technicians would use the image of a white woman, and this is called a Shirley card, with brown hair as the measuring stick against which they calibrated the colors. So even our original design of the data that we use in these biased algorithms was biased itself. So all of these essentially micro and macro decisions that are made impact how the algorithm then behaves. So we've talked about finance and medicine. I want to talk about engineering society at scale in a number of ways. I think Cathy O'Neill does a wonderful job of not only discussing in weapons of mass destruction a lot of the algorithms that are harmful out there, but developing a language, a system of physics, a way to describe what we're encountering in terms of, she's very much interested in algorithms that are important, secretive, and harmful. And in particular, ones that impact finance, livelihood, decisions around liberty, and decisions around information. 3 examples are the value-added model for teachers, which is a highly sensitive model that will output a teacher's performance in the education system, which is used for promotion, hiring, and firing decisions. It's a black box proprietary model that the teachers have no insight into, principals, superintendents have no insight into. So a widespread hiring model for minimum wage positions that has in it a personality test that essentially performs a mental health assessment, which is illegal. And Kathy goes into detail in this book with an example of a man named Kyle Beam, who essentially didn't receive, I think, something like 6 or 7 positions, all of which had this mental health assessment embedded in it. And then there's the notorious case, which I think a lot of us are aware of now, of North Point's Compass recidivism risk algorithm that's used in parole hearings, which is biased against people of color. The other example that I want to bring to light of engineering society at scale is Virginia Eubanks's book, Automating Inequality. It's a wonderful piece of investigative journalism, among other things, where Eubanks looks at these problems at very different scales from a very high level, how it impacts society at large, and then goes on the ground and speaks with particular caseworkers and people who are impacted by these algorithms. The examples are an attempt at automating welfare eligibility systems in Indiana, then a model that's used to determine whether or not children are at risk of abuse in Pennsylvania, and the third one is an algorithm used in LA to determine who's going to get housing out of the city's tens of thousands of homeless people. And what we see emerge in all these cases is that those at highest risk had all types of personal data collected with no regard or little regard for security, privacy, discussing with them. They were classified as risky investments and problematic parents, and they were also targets of vast networks of surveillance. One example is the child neglect algorithm, which in rolling out its predictions, it unfairly and unduly targeted black people. And one reason, and we'll see that this is a reason a lot of the algorithms fail, and it's referred to as a glitch a lot of the time, but it's really baked into it, is the use of proxies. As a proxy for maltreatment of children in this model, rather than maltreatment itself, the proxy that was used was something called re-referral, which includes anonymous and mandated reports of abuse, which are reported over 3 times more often for black and biracial families, according to Eubanks. I want to switch gears a bit now. So this is like a smorgasbord of all the dangers we're facing out there. I should have prefaced this by saying we're all doing a lot of great work as well, but I'm not here to talk about that. Hopefully some other people are today. If not, I'll probably get the one back downtown. Is how we're engineering information at a planetary scale. So I encourage you all to follow the work of Guillaume Chasleau, who was a software engineer at YouTube and left when his cries or pleas or attempts to have a discussion around the dangers of what YouTube is doing for our information civilization, he left then. On the eve of the US presidential election in 2016, and all his Jupyter notebooks are available online to see these analyses. He seeded a significant thousands of searches on YouTube and found that more than 80% of recommended videos were favorable to Trump, independent of whether the initial query was Trump or Clinton. To put this in context, I want you to know that approximately 70% of views on YouTube are generated by the recommendation algorithm, okay? And at this point, I think it's changed now, but at this point, YouTube was optimizing for view time. And of course, due to their essentially their surveillance revenues and advertising revenues. Now, people have said in optimizing for view time, it's just showing people what they want to see. And that catches me. I'm like, oh, is that true? I don't think it's true. It isn't showing people what they want to see. It's showing people what will keep their eyes stuck to the screen for the longest time. And I think I like the analogy Zeynep Tufekci uses. She said this is essentially analogous to an automated school cafeteria loading plates with fatty, salty, and sweet food because it's figured out that's what keeps kids there the longest, okay? So we've got a lot of kind of short-term and long-term considerations at play here as well. Once again, follow Chasleau's work. He's got wonderful interactive visualizations of what was happening at the time, among other things. He also points out that at least then, when you search for is the Earth flat or round and follow recommendations 5 times, more than 90% of recommended videos state that the Earth is flat, okay? So maybe it is. The last example I want to give of engineering information at a planetary scale, I think of in terms of essentially media. Netflix, also follow Netflix technical blog, it's amazing. Their blog and Stitch Fix, Algo blog, are 2 of my favorites. They have a wonderful post about how they've A/B tested thumbnails, right? And also, to put this in context, over 80% of content watched on Netflix is discovered through the recommendation engine as well, for what that's worth. So the example they give is that, let's say they think you might want to watch, oh wait, I got to point at, I forgot. You had one thing to remember, Hugo. Point at this screen. So yeah, if Netflix thinks you might be interested in watching Pulp Fiction, and you've been watching a bunch of Uma Thurman movies previously, they'll show you a thumbnail with Uma Thurman on it. If they think you want to watch Pulp Fiction, and you've been watching a bunch of John Travolta movies recently, and I have no idea why you would have been doing that, in all honesty, and I don't know why they haven't included Face Off. Maybe they don't have Face Off, but if you're watching John Travolta movies, I feel like you should watch the most underappreciated movie of the mid-90s, being Face Off. But what then happened is that several people of color discovered that they had thumbnails targeted at them that totally misrepresented the movie that was being advertised. So this example, like Father, these actors, as it says here, had maybe 10 minutes cumulative screen time in the movie, and the cast, as you can see down here, was Kristen Bell, Kelsey Grammer, and Seth Rogen. No idea why you'd put those 3 in a movie together. No idea why okay, no, I'm not going to go on about Frasier in general. But what we have here is absolutely a misrepresentation of what the movie is, because this has been A/B tested or experimented enough to say that these people of color will watch this if it's shown as such. Netflix said it doesn't track users' race or ethnicity. Of course, we know there are lots of proxies for all types of different things that algorithms can pick up. The most famous when thinking about race is zip code being used instead of race. But you can imagine that viewing history can be a relatively good proxy for race or ethnicity. So presumably, that's what's happening here. But guess what? We don't know, right? In wrapping up where we are, I wanted to just inject a bit of positivity in terms of talking about the virtuous cycle of AI, in which we give data to companies. They get more data to improve the product, they get more users, and then they generate more data and improve the product. And I'll direct you all to, Andrew Ng has a wonderful AI transformation playbook where he goes through a lot of these types of things. So this is all well and good, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't tell you about the not-so-virtuous cycle of AI. And this is from a wonderful book by Shoshana Zuboff. And I love these images as well, because it's, very difficult material, but it's almost comic booky, which I really dig. So down here, we see the virtuous cycle of AI, but then on top of that, all of what Zuboff refers to as our behavioral surplus is rendered into prediction products that are sold essentially on behavioral futures markets that then come back into the business as what she refers to as surveillance revenue. And in this sense, the product is not necessarily aligned with what the users, us, among many other people, what we want. And I'll quote Zuboff directly when a lot of the time we hear, if you don't pay for the product, you are the product. Zuboff says, forget the cliche that if it's free, you are the product. You're not the product, you are the abandoned carcass. The product derives from the surplus that is ripped from your life, okay? So there you go. I didn't mean to take it that far, but Zuboff definitely meant to take it that far. And I'll speak a bit more about this. Zuboff wonderfully she develops really a kind of a wonderful system of classification and laws of physics around this in terms of talking about the different economies that are at work here. I'll speak a bit about the economies of scale, where you want to get as many clicks and user data as possible. So click-scream, I like the idea of click-scream data. That's what we should all be doing in protest. Click-stream data is involved in these economies of scale. Economies of scope involve enlarging the type of data collected in two manners. First, by extension into the real world via IoT and wearables. You may have noticed that Google's acquiring Fitbit for $2.1 billion, which involves them acquiring 12 years of all Fitbit user data. So that's increasing extension into the real world. The second is by increasing its depth to render what's referred to as intimate patterns of the self, such as psychology, emotion, and mood. Such data can be retrieved from digital assistants, including voice assistants, and social media platforms such as Facebook. The third way that these systems will get into our world is economies of behavior, and that essentially sees surveillance capitalists in Zuboff's framing modify user behavior. Why would companies want to modify our behavior? Well, their surveillance revenue is based on the accuracy of their prediction products. So why predict with error bars when you can define the outcome, right? Seems smart to me. Examples of changing user behavior are Facebook getting people to vote by showing users that their friends have voted, which may be a good thing, but let's talk about it. Insurers and employers incentivizing exercise using fitness trackers by lowering insurance premiums, car insurers incentivizing safer driving, doing the same. And my favorite example is Pokemon Go, in which cafes, bars, and restaurants were able to get more traffic into their places of business by paying Pokemon Go to put Pokemon in the places of business. Little known fact, perhaps some of you knew this, Niantic, the software development company that built Pokemon Go, was formed as an internal startup within Google. And they experimented with Pokemon Go with a pay-per-visit model, which is analogous, of course, to the revolutionary pay-per-click model, which Google brought in the early noughties. With all that having been said, that's kind of the state in a lot of ways of where we are and across different parts of the world. I want to talk a bit how we got here, okay? One of the ways we got here is that people building these systems just haven't represented users. There's been a serious lack of empathy with respect to who's impacted by these algorithms when they're deployed at scale across society. I can speak to a lot of what's happened in tech, I think, and people such as Sophia Noble and Rachel Thomas, and AI Now as well, have a lot to say about how it isn't actually a pipeline problem, that there are exclusionary cultures and in the workplace, and that Silicon Valley is a very good example of this. And I think thinking about this at scale and at large, even in terms of the automated decision systems used in societies such as the recidivism risk model, what Cathy O'Neill talks about in Weapons of Mass Destruction, and all the examples Virginia Eubanks describes, the people building these models aren't on the ground with users and they don't represent users. So this is something that definitively will need to change, and we'll get to that. So this is kind of, once again, a smorgasbord of examples of how we got where we are. That's something cultural. There are technical reasons, there are historical reasons, and I'll take us through a few of these. Another is a paradigm shift from traditional software to software 2.0, as popularized by Andrej Karpathy. His blog post, his Medium post is fantastic, and I recommend it. He formalizes it essentially as software. In the software 2.0 world, software will be written in the weights of neural networks. I think about it slightly differently, that in the software 2.0 world, it will be defined, reinforcement learning aside, it will be defined by training data and objective functions, loss functions, okay? So we're no longer writing out all the for loops and all the if statements of what happens, but we're entering a world where which essentially we're building an infrastructure that assumes and then operationalizes the data and the loss function as an infallible and objective foundation for decision making, okay? Cassie Kozakov, chief decision scientist at Google Cloud, put this really well. Follow her as well. She's got wonderful posts that she writes explicitly, as the tools get better and better, you'll eventually see that there are only two real instructions in ML and AI. Optimize this goal on this data set. Okay? And one example of this happening very recently was Amazon scrapping their recruiting tool that showed bias against women. And it was the training data in particular which was bias there. I'll encourage you to play this game, which I think it's out of Mozilla Labs, or it's definitely affiliated with Mozilla, called Survival of the Best Fit, where you play an executive who's received some venture capital hiring, and then you need to automate the process for reasons of efficiency, and you see what happens there in a number of use cases. It's a 10-minute game. It's a great name as well, Survival of the Best Fit. So I'll encourage you to check that out. Now another reason we got where we are essentially has to do with objective functions and proxies. So you may know Goodhart's law, which states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Now, I don't know whether this story is apocryphal or a lot of people seem to think it's true, so I'll state it as, let's say, apocryphal truth. But this is a case in which Soviet factories were given targets based on the number of nails they produced, so they built thousands of tiny nails, which weren't useful. And then they were asked to optimize for the weight of the nails made, so that they then built a few giant heavy nails. So what's really happening there is that proxies are being used to replace goals, and nobody's getting what they want. And we saw this be really impactful even, a few weeks ago with a national healthcare algorithm that affects millions of people, in which, and once again, it's biased against people of color because it focused on costs for healthcare as opposed to actual health of patients and citizens. As Rachel Thomas has said, and once again I encourage you to follow all of her work, the problem with metrics is a big problem for AI because most AI approaches optimize metrics. Any metric is just a proxy. They can and will be gamed, and they overemphasize short-term concerns. And that's something that we saw in the case of the YouTube recommendation algorithm. Another historical fact and model I think that has led to where we are now is just the VC-backed growth model. And when I think about this, I'll point you to Brin Page's. I also found out recently that the PageRank algorithm isn't called the PageRank algorithm because it ranks pages. It's actually named after Larry Page, so I don't know if that naivety. Put up your hand if you knew that. Okay, I'm only slightly embarrassed. So in their paper, The Anatomy of a Large-Scale Hypertextual Web Search Engine, that's the quickest I've ever said that, in their appendix, they have an appendix called Advertising and Mixed Motives, in which they state the predominant business model for commercial search engines is advertising. The goals of the advertising business model do not always correspond to providing quality search to users. They then go on to say, we believe the issue of advertising causes enough mixed incentives that it is crucial to have a competitive search engine that is transparent and in the academic realm. You couldn't make this up, okay? So why then did they adopt an advertising business model? Well, in 2000, the dot-com bubble burst, right? And VCs were freaking out. Stephen Levy, in his book about Google, wrote, and I quote verbatim, the VCs were screaming bloody murder, tech salad days were over, and it wasn't certain that Google would avoid becoming another crushed radish. I've never heard that term before, but I definitely like it. AdWords had just been launched to some success, so Google went full throttle on the advertising model to not become another crushed radish. Another question is, why did the US government allow this type of surveillance to continue? Particularly when the FTC had issued a report in 2000 recommending legislation to regulate online privacy. One of the reasons was September 11 and national security. So after 9/11, the objective became security over privacy, and the data that Google was able to collect, along with the Patriot Act, made it easier for the government to spy on ordinary Americans. One other historical fact, well, it's very current as well, that I want to alert everyone's attention to is the existence from 1996 of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which essentially was developed, to my understanding, to protect ISPs from being responsible for stuff posted on their platforms. Sorry, through their networks, but is the main section that's used by tech companies and social media platforms to not be responsible for what people are posting. And now in Congress, both parties have singled out Section 230 for attack. From opposite sides though, in particular after 8chan once again hosted a hate-filled manifesto that was connected to a mass shooting. So I've got 5 minutes left, so I'm actually gonna, all these slides are available, I'm gonna skip through a bit to talk about paths forward. And the first thing I want to mention, I like Karl Polanyi's model for thinking about the relationship of humanity to technology and market forces. He thought of something called, well, conceptualized a double movement, called the double movement, which the first movement was the push for post-industrial revolution marketization of society, and the second movement against it were the social movements that pushed back and reasserted humanity and society through, for example, labor laws and tariffs. And I want to think about the types of places these can come from today in the pushback against all these data revolutions and AI revolutions we're seeing everywhere. I'm a big fan of the way Matt Jones and Chris Wiggins formalize this in their course here, Data, Past, Present, and Future. And they have an idea that, you know, the story of data is really a story of truth and power, and essentially how truth and powers are contested. There's a YouTube video of Chris discussing this course at Princeton, which I direct you to. Chris states explicitly that usually when people develop new powers, they're using it to defend their own power rather to empower the defenseless. And I think that's what we've seen a lot of in all of these examples. And Chris encourages us all to look at the present contests among the powers, such as the contest around Section 230, in order to understand the future, and formalizes these contests and powers as an unstable three-player game between, we see, let's get this right, and this is, of course, one of Chris's slides, between industry, private companies, government, and then the private market. And I'd like to think of this as a framework for thinking about how the second part of this double movement in this data and algorithm revolution can occur. So, what are paths forward? I really recommend you check out the AI Now report from 2018. They've got a lot of different recommendations. One, in terms of how these powers are contested, is to think about beyond the pipeline model, that tech companies just have to go beyond the pipeline model and commit to addressing the practices of exclusion and discrimination in their workplaces. Labor movements and employee walkouts are happening more and more. We've seen Amazon workers, Google workers, stop Google participating in Project Maven. Microsoft employees protest the work with ICE. And I quote Microsoft employees verbatim. They said, "As the people who build the technologies that Microsoft profits from, we refuse to be complicit. We are part of a growing movement comprised of many across the industry who recognize the grave responsibility that those creating powerful technology have to ensure what they build is used for good and not for harm." We recently saw Tableau workers walked off after Tableau was sold to ICE. See down here, maybe it's fine because having ICE use Tableau will stop them from scaling. Now, this is all well and good, employee walkouts, but as Ruha Benjamin writes, and this is literally me just taking a photo of a book as well. I think the future of slides is just photos of books. But so what Ruha wrote is that this kind of informed refusal by workers expressed by Google, Microsoft employees is certainly necessary as we build a movement to counter what she refers to as the new Jim Code, but we cannot wait for worker sympathies to sway the industry. She gives a number of examples of community-based activism that I would encourage you all to look into and work with. A lot of your skills will be applicable to these types of projects. The Digital Defense Playbook, intended to give marginalized communities a set of tools to reclaim agency and self-determination over their data and how it's used. The COP Accountability Project here empowers organizations and communities across New York City to hold police officers accountable for human rights violations. They run a database that tracks police misconduct in the city, and it's used by public defense, civil rights and human rights organizations. Other organizations such as Data for Black Lives and the Detroit Community Technology Project are doing a lot of great work here. I'm going to need to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but I look forward to discussing this a lot more with you in office hours, which I'm really excited about. I wanted to say a bit about legislative change. We're seeing a lot of pushback against facial recognition technology, data ownership, right to data deletion, right to be forgotten, these types of things in GDPR. Democrats in California proposing a bill that would create a set of user data rights similar to Europe's GDPR. With the facial recognition stuff, we may not even need legislation if we all become fans of the Insane Clown Posse, because it turns out that Juggalo makeup blocks facial recognition technology. That's clearly a joke. Other things to think about as future music, about work that's currently happening. The future of algorithmic audits, thinking about an FDA for algorithms. And in fact, I found out yesterday that I think there have been 15 to 25 algorithms in the health space that have actually been FDA approved. I'll also signal a bunch of other organizations for you to watch out for and to work with, such as AI Now, DataKind, Data and Society. All of those are in the city. FatML also, along with Black in AI, Women in Machine Learning, Queer in AI, and Latinx in AI. All that having been said, I just want to give you a few takeaways of what you can do today. Besides go to the rest of talks and speak with all the speakers. Contribute to any of these projects. I would encourage you to read and talk and educate widely. We're in positions of privilege here. Pressure your employers to consider the impact of your work on all stakeholders, and do the same to yourself. Pressure to move past the pipeline model. I'd encourage you to define principles in an ethical manner and design for them in a principled and robust manner in your work. And continually ask, who am I building these bridges for? And who's walking across them. And with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you all very much.